Welcome to this month's episode of Evidence of Greatness. And I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach to this edition. I recently got a question from somebody who was asking about this idea of, is solution-focused brief therapy systemic? And so there isn't a single article that kind of addresses this in a research-oriented way. And so I thought I would take kind of a more collective approach. But they mentioned that going through school, this was something that they oftentimes were asked or questioned about. And then trying to defend solution-focused brief therapy, they also have kind of come up lacking as they've looked for support for the idea of is SFBT systemic? And so I'm going to take just a general look at this. This is in no way a comprehensive consideration of the systemic nature of solution-focused brief therapy, but it's a good beginning and it's a good place to start. And obviously we can have more conversations if you're interested as we go forward. But the first thing that I want to kind of look at, sorry, my slides are, oh, there we go. All right, so just general principles of systems theory or systemic therapy. And so one of the things that's really important here is that the focus of systemic therapy is on interactions. And they're trying to see how systems help to maintain the problem. And so in a minute, I'll talk about how solution-focused brief therapy kind of matches up with this. But I just want to run through these really quickly. But interactions are a huge important concept of systemic therapy. In addition, the focus on communication and the fact that communication is a form of interaction. So not always do we have to look at behavioral interactions within people, but we can look at communication interactions. And they break this down into two components. One is what they call report, which is the actual meaning behind the words that are being used. And then command is what those words mean, or how they are perceived, or how they're interpreted. And oftentimes this is called meta communication. And so systems theories or system therapies are looking at the words that are being used, and they're also looking at the way that the words are being interpreted, the way that the words are being received, the way that the words are given meaning. The third component is homeostasis. And really what that is talking about is they're looking for a balance within the family and the way that the family interacts. And so this is where the idea of looking for patterns occurs, that families tend to behave in a very consistent way. And that is what they define as the family's homeostasis. And so within homeostasis, they look at first order change, which is a change in behavior, which can create just usually a short-term change. And so oftentimes if one of the family members just does something different one time, that's a first order change. And that will create a change for a moment, but then usually the family is focused on returning back to a place of homeostasis, or the way that we normally function. Second order change is when the family realizes, oh, our rules need to change. The way that we interact needs to change. And so they overtly communicate and say, now we're going to do this differently. This is how we're going to interact, or this is the way we behave now. And so this idea of meta communication comes back into play. If we're going to recalibrate our system, then we communicate about the new rules of our system, which does kind of lead us into the next component, which is feedback loops. And the idea of feedback loops is that information is fed back into the system, which then perpetuates itself. And either this feedback can go into the system in a way that maintains homeostasis, which is what they call a negative feedback loop, or it can go back in and say we need to change the way that we interact, which is the positive feedback loop. And so again, this is the idea of meta communication would help us to move away from our traditional way of functioning, and therefore that would encourage a positive feedback loop. What we're doing doesn't seem to be working anymore. And then the final component that I'm going to consider here is this is the types of relationships. Is it a symmetrical relationship? That's a typo actually. So is it a symmetrical relationship, or is it a complementary relationship? And in essence, what those mean, without getting too much into the weeds here, is that these are basically just examples of the ways that people can interact. Either we're two peas in the pod, or we're opposites and we tend to interact with each other as opposites. And so these are just examples of the way that people interact. So that's kind of the foundation of what creates a systemic approach, or what things people who work from a systemic perspective are focusing on. So then it begs the question, does solution-focused brief therapy attend to these things? Does it fit into a systemic nature? So I'm going to just take these ideas and I'm just going to break them down just a little bit. The first one is this focus on interactions. I think one of the really important things is that there's a shift here, that traditional systemic therapy says that the family or the system works to maintain the problem. And because solution-focused brief therapy isn't problem-focused, that side of the definition doesn't necessarily fit. We don't look at what's maintaining the problem, but in fact, we look at how could the family interact or behave that would sustain something different or sustain their desired outcome. And so, although this isn't entirely consistent because we're not looking at the problem, the premise of this principle still holds up, that we're looking at how do people interact with one another. And oftentimes we'll look at that through language. How are they communicating with each other? What are they noticing about each other? How do they communicate that they've noticed those things? And so many of those questions that we ask that sometimes get called relational questions, all of those relational questions really help us to understand what happens when you start to communicate differently. What do you notice about each other? How do you communicate about what you've noticed? How do you communicate about the perceptions of meaning that you have? And so from this perspective, I would say SFBT really does fall in line with this systemic perspective. In addition to that, I would say we see the system as holding the keys to achieving their desired outcome. If a family comes in and they say, we want to be happier, or we want to get along better, solution-focused brief therapy says the system itself has everything it needs in order to achieve that desired outcome. And so much of what we're going to focus on is the resources that they have that would make that possible, times where the family has interacted in a happy way before, or in the future, if the family did interact in a way that they were hoping to interact, what would they notice about each other and how would that communicate something different? So again, absolutely, if the family comes in and we want to work from a systemic perspective and we want to integrate all of their desired outcomes, these relational questions really can help us to do that. But even more fundamental to that is we believe that the family holds everything that it needs in order to function the way that they would like to. The second then consideration is this idea of communication as a form of interaction. And this is so consistent with solution-focused brief therapy. Obviously, we say all the time, SFBT is a language-oriented approach. From the basic principle of the therapist and the client sitting in a room together, we call that co-construction. You and I are working together to construct a desired outcome description. I can't do my job without you, and you can't do your job without me. This is so systemic in its very nature that we say, in essence, if either one of those people are missing, this form of therapy doesn't work. It could only work if there was a system in place. Things like psychoeducation just require a therapist to give some information. And obviously there has to be a receiver on the end, but the receiver doesn't have to do anything except for passively take that information in. They don't have to feed back into the system. They don't have to say, did it work or did it not work? But with this co-constructive process, without that constant feedback going in, we cannot move forward with the description. So in addition to that, just highlighting some of the other things that we've mentioned a little bit before of this, our work consistently is about asking who else will notice. Who would be the first person to notice? What would they notice? What difference would that make to them? How would they let you know that they had noticed? How would they let you know that this has made a difference? What impact would it have on you that they noticed in this way? And again, it's through these interactions that the description becomes really, really rich. One of the things that we say all the time is that a good desired outcome is really an internal state. But how we come to realize the presence of that internal state is by making that internal state external through behavior, through action, through communication, and then talking about the interaction between other people. So we make the internal external, and then we make the external interactional. So we are really focused on interaction because that's what actually adds the details to the description that we're creating. So again, on this second component, I would say solution-focused brief therapy is absolutely consistent with systemic therapy. The third idea is this idea of homeostasis, that families seem to function at a particular level. And this is what I would say is that's probably true, but that focus in a therapy focus is really about maintaining the problem. And so I would say we're not so concerned about what's maintaining homeostasis, but what we are concerned is about what kind of homeostasis they want to achieve. In essence, what desired outcome do you have? What transformation are you hoping to achieve? So we don't so much focus on what's maintaining the current homeostasis, but we talk about what would need to be in place in order for a new homeostasis to be present. And in cybernetics, they talk about this as a recalibration. And so we do this first by talking about what differences would you notice, right? If your desired outcome, if this new homeostasis were present, what would you notice? But that's a first order change. You notice, oh, I behave differently, or this happened differently. And that's why we need to go on to these other forms of difference, which is second, what difference would those differences make? What impact would that have on you and your family? What difference would that make to the rules that you're living by? How would that change the way that you're communicating with each other? That's getting us to a second order change. And then the third level of difference is this meaning that those differences make. If you started to notice this difference and it made a difference, what would that mean about you, right? Now we're really in this place of developing a new homeostasis. We're recalibrating. This is the essence of a second order change. So really, we focus on transformation, but we do this through communication and through focusing on first and second order changes that need to take place in order to maintain that recalibrated homeostasis. So again, SFBT is really consistent with a systemic perspective. The fourth is that feedback loops play a part, right? We're constantly, in every iteration of this conversation, we're constantly taking in information that we're receiving. The client answers, and it's my responsibility as an SFBT therapist to utilize their words. So their information they give to me is built into my consideration. My question incorporates that language and it comes back at them. They take the language of that question and they answer. One of the perspectives that we regularly talk about is this idea of presupposition. If my question includes a presupposition and the client answers that question, they have simultaneously accepted the premise or the presupposition that question entails. That system in and of itself of taking in information, utilizing the client's language, them understanding the presupposition and accepting the presupposition, that is a consistent feedback loop that's helping us to move. In addition, going back to those levels of difference, we're constantly asking them, what would you notice? What difference would that make? How would they communicate that? So we're constantly asking them to focus on the feedback that they're getting, the information that's going back into the system. And we're constantly bringing it back to what would you do as a result of that? In addition, when we talk about follow-up sessions, we regularly begin by saying, what's been better? In essence, give me some feedback about how our conversation influenced the rest of your life. That feedback is going to influence what we do in this session. So that in and of itself, from session to session, is a feedback loop that feeds into itself. In addition, this is all client driven. They get to determine where we go, what we talk about, what their desired outcome is, what they notice that's been different. So all of this feedback is necessary in order for me to continue to be able to do my job. So here again, you can hear SFBT has a real systemic emphasis. And then this last component, again, which is that symmetrical or complementary relationships, we're not so much focused on what types of relationships they have. Because again, in some sense, those things help us to understand how the problem is being maintained or how homeostasis is present. And we're looking at transformation. So we don't necessarily care so much about what types of relationships they have, but we do care a whole lot about their perception of how different individuals will interact with them. And so this is not quite a direct fit, but we could absolutely incorporate this into the work if we needed to. So I also then wanted to take you to this article written by Keeney and Keeney, and they talk about what is systemic, and they really lay out lots of critiques, basically, of postmodern approaches of solution-focused brief therapy being one of those. They don't name solution-focused brief therapy by name, but they do kind of talk regularly about postmodern therapies and how this emphasis on what they call second-order cybernetics is erroneous, and that it deteriorates this idea of first-order cybernetics, which is what family therapy was originally, or systemic therapy was really founded on. And so I just thought it would be important to address a few of the things that they mention here, because in some sense, they would question, is solution-focused brief therapy really systemic? They talk about that therapists generally limit their diagnosis to observing how the system responds to efforts of change. That's a definition, right? And again, you can hear in this, solution-focused brief therapy doesn't rely on diagnosis. It doesn't look at what's maintaining that problem. And so I think that's a pitfall that we avoid. Many at the MRI, which is the Mental Research Institute, believed that power was potentially toxic to punctuating human experiences. And they talked about that if we look at the interaction rather than where power is. And this is an invitation to more choice of action within a problematic situation. So they say, we don't need to look at power because we're looking at the interaction. And on the one hand, I would say we in solution-focused brief therapy agree. We're constantly looking at interactions, and power doesn't oftentimes come up in the overt questions that we ask. So on the one hand, we fit with that very nicely. On the other hand, I would say we really absolutely consider the context, but we ask the client to lead that process. So when we say, who would notice, who would be most pleased to see this change? We're constantly asking them to consider power within the answers of those questions. And so I think it is important for us to remember context and social location and those kinds of things should absolutely influence the questions we ask. But we don't bring up this idea of power because that is a knowing position from the clinician. And so instead of doing that, and that's one of the critiques that Keeney and Keeney make, is that a lot of these postmodern models think about power and they say, oh, I need to address power and I need to assume that power is there and I need to bring it up as part of the narrative. And they're saying by holding that conception, that preconceived notion of what you need to talk about, you actually are taking away choice from the clients. And so again, I think we fit really nicely with the original cybernetic perspective here, where we say we let the client develop the meaning. One of the critiques that they have is this idea of circularity, which is one of the original cybernetic principles. And they say therapists utilizing the outcomes of her efforts to change a client. What this means is they say, I utilize, did this therapy work, or what was different in order to change the client? And that's what they talk about as circularity, that I take that information and I use it. And they say circularity as actually interactional differences. And so they say lots of people just focus on meaning making, and they don't really try to influence their client, and they don't let the client influence them. And I think that's where we really do, again, align with the systemic approach in its original form in cybernetics, which is we really, again, if we look at language as a form of interaction, we're constantly taking into consideration what our language is doing to the client and what the client's language is doing to our questions. And so we're really looking at this idea of circularity and that it is going around and around. In addition, Keeney and Keeney really emphasize the difference between narrativity and interactivity. And they say lots of these postmodern models, they talk about being systemic because they change narratives and they influence narratives. And really what they're saying is we change behavior. We're looking at the difference between action. We want to look at how I influence you, how you influence me, but really in the family, how does one family member influence another family member? And I think this is a gray line for solution-focused brief therapy. I would say we do both. We really do focus on constructing narratives, but many of those narratives build descriptions of interactivity. And so I would say we straddle the line here where we probably do both of those things. And then the final point here is they say there's a focus. The focus is the interaction and not, the focus is on the interaction and not on the model or the theory behind the interaction. And they said many of these postmodern models, they're saying, well, we do this, or we theorize this, or we talk about this. And they say that in and of itself changes the focus to the theory and what the theory is doing, instead of just keeping it on the interaction. And they say systemic theories keep the focus on the interaction. And then there's this really cool quote here. They said the alternative to robotic therapies that are programmed by models is a changing therapist who is ready to be inspired by the movements inside each unique relational engagement. And if that is not a description of solution-focused brief therapy, I don't know what it is. That we approach each interaction, and I would even go further and say each utterance, as something that's moving, something that we can be inspired, something that requires us to be creative, something that encourages us to be thinking on our toes, incorporating that language. And so I would say a lot of the critiques that Keeney and Keeney point out about postmodern models and why they're not systemic, I would say solution-focused brief therapy really avoids many of those. And so I would encourage you to look at this read. It's a bit of a difficult read, but it is really important, and it does highlight some points about how we might deviate from other postmodern approaches. So I hope that's helpful for you. The last couple of things that I want to do is just look at SFBT within larger systems. And I just have 5 points here that SFBT conversations can't happen without acknowledging the systemic nature of co-construction. And I've talked a little bit about this, but client and therapist are inherently co-constructing. And so we view this interaction as systemic, that we are a system influencing each other. In addition to that, the second point, SFBT conversations always ask the client to consider and describe the interactions they have with others. And I've talked about this a bit. This is where noticing comes into play. So we're always asking our clients to put themselves within their system and talk about how their change will influence the system's change. Third, SFBT conversations can and should weave more than one desired outcome together. We talk about this a lot when we say mandated clients, right? If you have a mandated client, you automatically have the desired outcome of the judge or the parole officer or whoever sent them here. And it's our job as solution-focused brief therapists to say, if you got your desired outcome and the system was pleased with the outcome of this process as well, what would you begin to notice and what would be different? In addition to that, though, when couples come in, we say, if you had happiness and you got peace, and those things coexisted. And we talk a lot about in our teaching that 2 desired outcomes can't be mutually exclusive. So I need to get to a place where I can find a desired outcome where both people's desired outcomes can come together and be woven into one consistent description. And that's the same if I have 2 people in a couple, or if I have more people than that in a family. And so I think, again, we have to look at this as weaving together multiple descriptions into one consistent description. Fourth, SFBT cannot be done effectively without understanding the client's context and social location. Those components should influence my questions. I should say things like, given everything that you're dealing with, or given what's going on in our country at this point, what would let you know that you have the kind of peace that you're looking for? So I need to incorporate their social location into my questions. I need to understand that the larger system will influence their answers. But then in addition to that, I need to remember, and this is the fifth point, that SFBT believes that change in a client, a singular client, will result in a change within all of the systems they are embedded in. So I need to understand that one change within this client is going to change their family system, their couple system, their larger cultural system, all of the systems they fit into. If they show up as a different version of themselves, they will inherently change that system. And I have to understand that so that I can ask about those things. Who would notice and what difference would it make? And how would they respond to this change? And how would they see you when they interact with you in this way? And so I can't do this work without considering the systemic nature within which the client is positioned. Now, finally, I'm going to give you just some articles, and you can see just short references here, but I highlighted, so this is SFBT research that was done with couples, and you can see here I've listed 6 different studies. What I want to point out about these studies is that all of these studies, if you go to the SFU's searchable database, you will be able to find all of these studies by simply putting in the title or these authors. So if you want to find these, just go to the SFU searchable database, enter this information, and you'll find it. But you can see here, lots of research has been done with SFBT and couples. There's how are they in parenting? What's their relationship satisfaction like? How are they dealing with the couples? What happens when we put groups of couples together? And you can see here that lots of research is considering solution-focused brief therapy as systemic simply because they're working with couples. And then similarly here, you can see here are 6 additional studies with SFBT and families. And you can see this is about parenting and sibling relationships and family functioning. And can you do this in a brief situation? Can you do it with families that are separating and parents that are getting divorced? Now, these are not all of the studies that have been done with families or with couples, but again, you can find these and others on the SFU searchable database. So again, I've just given you 12 studies that show SFBT is systemic. This is being done with couples, being done with families, being done in systems. And so if people wonder and question, point them to this research and let them know, yeah, it is. It's systemic because it meets the criteria of the principles, but it also has a lot of research that shows it's effective within systems. And then the final slide I want to give you is the URL to the searchable database. So that's here at the top. And then 2 references, the Keeney and Keeney article that I referenced before, and then Pragmatics of Human Communication, which outlines a lot of those principles about systems that I covered at the beginning. So I hope that was helpful to you. I hope that you understand that it's important for us to consider solution-focused brief therapy as systemic because it changes the way that we look at our work. It changes the way that our questions are formulated. It changes how our questions are asked because we're asking people to put themselves within the context of their system. And so absolutely, I would say solution-focused brief therapy is systemic, and we need to make sure that other people understand that it is. So if you have questions about this or you have comments that you think that I would really benefit from hearing, I would love to hear it. If you feel like other people would benefit from this information, please make sure to share it with them too. But in the meantime, if you have other questions that you want me to consider on evidence of greatness, please just let me know and I'll do my best to consider that. But until next time, I hope you have a great day, and I hope that you now have a greater understanding about how SFBT is systemic.